Okay, welcome. Welcome again. For those of you who are not at dinner, my name is Harry Dammer. I'm the chair of the Criminal Justice Department here at the University of Scranton, and very happy to be with you and the National Convocation of Jail and Prison Ministry this week till Wednesday. Just saw our nice banner that they just put up there. So if you forget where you are, you look over here. So again, we're very, very happy to have Mr. John Wetzel with us today, the Secretary of the Department of Corrections. To say that Mr. Wetzel has a big job, it would be a serious underestimate. I would really be underestimating in a big way. Mr. Wetzel is in charge of a corrections department which houses over 51,000 inmates, over 17,000 employees, and a $1.8 billion budget. Right? So. You know, but your dinner was free tonight. Don't worry, you don't have to take that. You don't have to take that out of the budget. But that's really a big job, a very important job, as you know. But Mr. Wetzel has been in corrections for over 20 years, on working in jails, working as a counselor, working as an administrator, a number of boards, as well as local boards, things in the community. And interestingly, he's also a member of the American College Football Coaches Association. Mr. Wetzel was a football coach at one time, and that's one of his passions, I'm sure. So I found that interesting, and we always like to add the little sports flavor in there when we can. So we're very, very happy to have him, and he's going to speak to us about implementing community justice in Pennsylvania. Some of you who aren't from Pennsylvania might not know that Pennsylvania is a state very progressive in the way of restorative justice. In the 1990s, restorative justice became mandatory in the juvenile justice system and in the law in Pennsylvania, and now it's infiltrated into the adult system, and I'm sure Mr. Wetzel is going to tell us about that tonight. So again, welcome, and Mr. Wetzel, please.
Well, thank you. It's good to see you all here, and I appreciate the invite. We always enjoy opportunities to come and talk about the correction system in Pennsylvania. And on behalf of Governor Corbett, I just want to officially thank you for this opportunity. It's exciting times in government, and maybe someone described the times we're in now as exciting, but I would, and that's probably why I'm in this position. As you know, when the Corbett administration came on board 18 months ago, came on board with a $4 billion budget deficit. And if you look, and when you talk about corrections, and you look around the country, what I heard over the past several years, and certainly since I got this job, is that why is Pennsylvania's prison population growing when all our adjacent states and all states around the country's population is decreasing? So that's kind of the backdrop that we came in, and I know there's some folks here who aren't from Pennsylvania. So let me just kind of outline our department, and the introduction touched on a little bit. We have 27 state prisons, if you include our boot camp, to house about 51,500 inmates. We have roughly 16,000 staff members, and that's our prison system. But we also have a sizable community correction system, which you may be familiar as halfway houses of various sizes and designs. We have 14 of those halfway houses that we run, that the state runs. We have an additional 40 of them that are contracted. And we have 3 right here in Scranton, I believe. So it's a huge, huge system. And that huge system also has a huge cost. $1.86 billion is our budget amount. And if you look at our prison population over time, especially over the last 20 years, something will jump out at you, and it certainly jumped out at the governor after the election. What you'll see is a significant increase in population in the Department of Corrections. At the same time, you'll see an increase in overall population to the citizens of the state, but not at the same scope as the growth in the prison population. But most interestingly, you will not see a growth in crime that equals the growth in prison population. So what does that mean? That means that a response to crime in Pennsylvania over the years is unequal to crime itself. And let me state that more specifically. Our response to crime is more severe than the increase in crime itself. And that's how you get to a place where we're spending nearly $2 billion on prisons. And when you look at the state budget the governor proposed is $27.1 billion. About 80% of that goes between education, which is in the 10 to 11 billion range, Department of Public Welfare, which is in the 10 to 11 billion dollar range. And then the Department of Corrections is the third biggest expenditure at nearly $2 billion. So the states around us have got to a point where they decided that they couldn't afford to do business as usual. Now, clearly, we're a little behind that, but we're too at the same place. And I think what you see at most of the states who've gotten to where we're at, where we make a decision that we can't keep doing business as usual in the corrections, is that it's driven by money. But I don't really worry about what the motivation is. The reality is, from day one of the corporate administration, the governor said we can't build our way out of this corrections problem. And we really need to look at, first, how we got where we're at, and second, to develop a path or a vision as to how we can get out of where we're at. And let me start, before I start talking about how we got to where we're at, let me start with this. I think in criminal justice issues, when you talk about legislation and you talk about philosophy, rarely can you get 4 people to agree on the same thing. But every single person I've talked to agrees on one thing, that when an individual gets criminally involved, what we want out of our system is that when they come out of the back end of that system, we want them to be less likely to commit another crime. Everybody agrees on that. Now, how we get from point A to point B, not so much agreement. But everybody agrees that the goal of our system is to reduce someone's future criminality. We take corrections seriously, and we mean it literally. We believe that our role as the Department of Corrections is to correct individuals so when they get out the back end, they're at least no worse and hopefully better. But we don't believe that our system yields that result right now. And I'll tell you why, because 44% of the people who get out the back end come back. Now, some of those come back for new crimes, some of them come back for parole violations. Either way, what that means, and we call that the recidivism rate, but what that really means is that they're getting out and they're not being good citizens. They're not being productive citizens, right? They're not following the rules and regulations. And again, we can argue over the rules and the supervision, all that stuff, but the reality is they're coming back. So we're not doing something right. So how do we fix this? And one of the key things that when you hear from politicians like me is we say all kinds of stuff, but I really think the best way to find out what we're about is to look at the actions. So let's start with that. Let's start with what the corporate administration has done in the correction system since day one. One of the first things we did in January of 2011 was we stopped the construction of a new prison in southwest Pennsylvania in Fayette County called German Township. It was a 2,300 bed prison that had been designed. There was about $1 million spent on site prep, and the governor pulled the plug on it. And yeah, there was people who weren't clapping. They held up my confirmation for about 5 months. So, but the governor felt like it was important that if we were serious about trying to improve how we administer justice in Pennsylvania, we had to put all our chips on the table. And that's the first signal he sent. I said, we're not going to try to build our way out of this. Now, at the same time, there's 2 other ones being built, all right, that weren't stopped. The one is in Benner Township, which is nearing completion. That was too far beyond stopping. The other one on the grounds of SCI Graterford is a replacement facility for Graterford. And actually the legislation specifically dictates that there's only 4,000 inmates allowed on that site. So it is a replacement. I know there's been rumbles that, oh, you're just going to add another one, but that's a replacement. So the first thing the governor did is said, we're not going to increase capacity. So if we're going to make our system work, we have to do what? decrease population. The second thing we did was start bringing inmates back from out of state. When we took over, there was 2,100 inmates out of state. There was 1,100 in Michigan, and there was 1,000 in Virginia. So shortly after we came on board, we brought the individuals back from Michigan. There was a 6-month notice, so they all got back from Michigan within our first 6 months. And that signals, again, when you look at what our goal of our system is, the governor realizes, and we all realize, that having individuals close to their support systems are a key part of attaining our goal, right, of reducing criminal behavior. And Michigan is not close to anybody's support system who was there, not in Pennsylvania. So, and at the same time, that was, I mean, if I'm being honest, that was the plan of the previous administration. There was an expansion after the parole moratorium in 2009, and kind of how we, let me step back to how we got here. 2009, 2 parolees got out and committed violent acts in the city of Philadelphia. Governor Rendell shut down the parole system in Pennsylvania for a period of time. I believe it was 60 days, perhaps 90 days. That one act increased our population by 4,200 inmates. 4,200 inmates that are still here, not the same inmates, but it caused a bubble in our population that we've not overcome. Now, what does 4,200 inmates mean in dollars? $120 million a year, operational costs for 2 prisons. All right? So we had a bad situation, and after that bad situation, shut down parole. It took the parole board a year for the parole rate to go back up to where it was. And our parole rate in Pennsylvania is at about 60%, which is a lot higher than some. But for instance, Texas is 31% of the people who see parole get paroled. And it's really not a lot lower than many states. There's some that are up around the 68 to 69% range. So Pennsylvania, actually, the parole rate is not that out of whack. But it took a year for the parole rate to get back up there. So again, that blip caused 4,200 inmates. And then all the inmates were sent out. So then the state expanded a lot of prisons and put housing units all over the system. Well, those housing units were completed around the end of 2010. So we had the ability to bring the inmates back. After we brought that group back, then we brought the 1,000 inmates back from Michigan. They all were back, I think, by the end of March of this year. So in our first year, year and a half, we did a couple things. 1, we stopped the construction, and 2, we brought all the inmates back. And it's those kinds of things that should tell you that we're serious about what we're talking about. Now let's talk about how we got to where we're at as one of the highest incarcerated. We have the 6th highest prison population in the country, in our state prisons. And I'm talking specifically about our state prisons. Our county jails have another 36,000 inmates. So if you look and add them both together, you know, we're right around the 90,000 incarcerated individuals on a daily basis in Pennsylvania. But I'm talking specifically about the state prisons. So let's talk about how we got to where we're at. People ask me often, well, tell me about corrections policy in Pennsylvania. And I don't believe we have corrections policy in Pennsylvania. Because when you hear policy, that implies that we've made conscious decisions, right, on how we're going to respond to crime. That's not how we got here. We didn't make conscious decisions along the way at how we respond to crime. Rather, what has occurred is there's been a series of seemingly unrelated pieces of legislation in response to specific acts. No different than what happened when the 2 parolees got out and killed people, right? So something happens and we react to it. And in some cases, we've legislatively react to it. And we pass these laws and this and that. So that the combination of all these laws have got to a place where a population is where it's at. So then the corollary to that, if you want to fix it, is that we really need to make conscious decisions on how we want to respond to crime. The $4 billion budget deficit creates an environment where people are going to be serious about looking at corrections. Because frankly, and the experience across the country is that when we have money, we're okay with paying for incarceration. We are. And you may want to argue with that, but you'd be wrong. I mean, but we're in a crisis. We're in a place now where we can't afford to keep doing business as usual. At the same time, we have a governor who was the attorney general, right, for 6 years. And one of the realities of politics and how you really do corrections reform is that in election years, politicians do not want to be accused of being soft on crime. Well, nobody, even the people who can't stand the governor, are going to accuse him of being soft on crime. So the combination of where we're at financially and a law and order kind of law enforcement based governor gives us the opportunity to really look hard at the system. So when we first came on board, I was fortunate enough to be named chairman of the governor's transition team before I was appointed to this position, along with Ed Marsico, who's a district attorney from Dauphin County in Harrisburg. And we spent 2 months doing nothing but looking at the Department of Corrections, looking at the Board of Probation and Parole, and really looking at it objectively and saying, what do we do well and what don't we do well? So that's kind of the backdrop. Then we came in and we spent the first 6 months really assessing the system. And we found a couple things. Our system is broke in several places, right? And the first place is at the front end. And it goes all the way back to decision making when somebody becomes criminally involved. In 2008, there was a corrections reform package that was passed. That corrections reform package included 2 very important tools that Pennsylvania lacks that other states who do good criminal justice have. And that's a risk-based sentencing tool. And what risk-based sentencing is simply looking at the factors that led to criminality, identifying the root causes, and giving all that information to a judge so they can make a decision, a sentencing decision, and a place of confinement decision on facts. Now, what a novel idea that is, right? Imagine that. We're going to make decisions on where we put people on facts. So that was passed in 2008. And also a parole violation matrix, I call it. Or the Pennsylvania Commission on Sentencing is going to develop this tool that said if the offender under supervision does A, B will happen, swiftly and certainly and consistently. So that was passed in 2008. You're wondering why I'm sitting up here in 2012 and we still don't have it. Because it was passed but not funded. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? So the good news to that piece is that we funded it to $400,000 to start the process this year, and grant money that was actually designated for the Department of Corrections. And then I'll tell you about the funding of it later when I talk about our response. So that's the first thing at the front end. But there's also things going on at the front end of our system as it relates to local law enforcement, and specifically in distressed communities, in these distressed cities around the state. And we're getting more and more financially distressed cities. And an interesting thing you see happen there. You're seeing that the local law enforcement system is being stressed because money's tight, right? So a lot of these systems end up doing buyouts, right? Because you can pay a new cop a lot less than you can pay a mature cop, right, to do the same thing. So you see a lot of that. Then you also see the numbers of police officers dropping. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but what we find is that when the local police resources are taxed, you get less enforcement. And you get less enforcement of the kind of minor stuff. But what really works is good enforcement of the minor stuff and interceding in someone's life of crime early on in that life of crime. So you see less arrests for minor things, but you also see more major crimes, right? And so for those distressed communities, we see an increase in the amount of people coming to the Department of Corrections. And if you look to our neighbors in New York, right, when Mayor Giuliani was there, they talk about the broken windows theory. And I don't want to talk theory around professors because I know I'm making stuff up. But But the broken window theory is that, you pay attention to little stuff, right? Pay attention to vandalism, pay attention to broken windows. And then you respond with swift and certain sanctions, but not long sanctions. And the combination of those two things reduces how many people come to the State Department of Corrections. Well, we don't do that, all right? We don't have the tools to do that in many of our communities. So we're seeing, while we're seeing a reduction in crime rate and we're seeing a reduction in, or a flattening out of violent crime, we're still seeing an increasing amount of people coming to the Department of Corrections. So that's the front end. The other piece of the front end is local probation and parole. Local probation and parole play a huge role in the criminal justice system. And frankly, from the state standpoint, we've basically ignored local probation and parole. 10 years ago, local probation and parole was funded at about an 85% rate through this grant and aid program. At this point, they're funded at about a 15 or 20% rate. But at the same time, they have more people. And the only true diversion program we have in Pennsylvania, and when I say true diversion, means you commit a crime and you can actually be diverted out of the system, not through the system, into a program. All right? True diversion means you never come to the Department of Corrections. Now, we have some programs that we call diversion in the department, but once you come to the department, you haven't been diverted, right? Diverted means you don't get there. So the County Intermediate Punishment, or CIP, is the only true diversion program we have in this state, but the funding of that has gone down significantly. And what the result of the funding going down to County Intermediate Punishment is that very few people actually get services through it. About 1,100 inmates or individuals a year get services through that County Intermediate Punishment. So that's not funded. And jumping back to law enforcement for a second, federal and state dollars that went to local law enforcement were $15 million 10 years ago. It's $2 million right now. So we have a front end that's stressed. And when the front end is stressed, or when any system that is a consequential system, when the lower end gets stressed, what happens? More people go to the next level. All right? So then local jails, and actually in Pennsylvania, we have some jurisdictions that have done great things in their local systems. The development and the support of the local criminal justice advisory boards. And if you're in Pennsylvania and you're involved in prison ministry or anything with the criminal justice system, the local criminal justice advisory boards is a group that generally, most of them have public meetings that you should be involved in, because that's really the nexus of where criminal justice policy is made at the county level. So we've seen some counties through the criminal justice advisory board do great things. Great things like mental health courts, like treatment courts. These are programs that work. And let me give you, for instance, we try to make decisions based on data. We look at our mental health population, and we have folks from Waymart here, and Waymart is where our forensic treatment center is. We do a very, very good job at Waymart dealing with the mentally ill. The bad news to that story is that we have to have several mental health units across the system, because the number of mentally ill individuals coming to us is going through the roof. It's about 20% of our population generally. With females, it's about 48% of our females are on the mental health roster. That's 48. That's almost 1 in 2. So looking around the state, there's several counties, I think the number's around 17 to 20, that have mental health courts. And guess what? When we map the state and look at where we get mentally ill offenders from, percentage-wise, we get less mentally ill offenders from counties that have mental health courts than ones that don't. These are programs that work. And the key, again, is what the root cause of the behavior is. What was the root cause of the crime? If the root cause of the crime was mental illness or addiction, putting someone in a state prison, or even a county jail for that matter, isn't going to address the root cause. If you send someone to a state prison because they're mentally ill and don't address the mental illness, they're still mentally ill. You don't address addiction, they're still addicted. Okay? So we need to look at what outcome are we looking for. And again, let's point to that outcome. We want people to not be criminally involved when they get out of our system. So in many cases, it's a treatment need that requires a treatment response. Okay? So that's kind of the front end of our system. The middle part of our system, we'll call the Department of Corrections. And there's things that the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections does very well. We have very solid treatment programs. We do a good job with offenders who are sent to us for years. What we don't do a good job at is offenders who are sent to us for less than a year. We call that group of offenders short mins, right? Which is short for short minimums. So a short minimum who comes to the Department of Corrections is anyone who has less than 1 year to serve when they hit our door. Now, we get about 20,000 commitments a year. Of those, about 10,000 are sentenced from court. 3,500 of those 10,000 come to us with less than a year to serve. Now, here's the rub on those. Generally, they've served about 6 months in the county. Generally, they have somewhere around 4 to 6 months to serve until their minimum. And generally, they serve about 40% more than their minimum. Not because letting them out would impact public safety, but because we have a system that's not set up to deliver the programming and the assessment to offenders who are with us for a short period of time, because we're not a jail system, we're a prison system. So if you walk across the border to other states, you would not see anybody with a misdemeanor in their state prisons. Anybody guess how many misdemeanors we have in our system? 5,000. 5,000 individuals in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections where the most serious crime is a misdemeanor. Now, true enough, in Pennsylvania's the breakdown of felonies and misdemeanors, there's some things, misdemeanor ones and some misdemeanor twos, that in other states will be classified as felonies. That's still a lot of people for nothing but a misdemeanor in state prison. And then when you throw on the fact that they serve more time than they should just because our system is inefficient and we're not set up for inmates like that, that's a big issue, right? That's a big challenge for us. If you add short mins and medium mins, people with less than 2 years to serve, that group makes up about 65 to 70% of the sentences we get. All right? That group also serves, on average, 200 days over their minimum. That's 200 days over their minimum. That's a lot of time. And those 200 days, oh, by the way, are at $90 a day. That's the cost. So when you see that, when you see a group who's populating your prisons and who's making up part of that 51,000 inmates who are there simply because of system inefficiencies, that means you got to change the system, right? Then the next idiosyncrasy we have in our system, and that's a nice way to put it, is the program delivery. And this really is part of the short min issue. So we have people who come in with less than a year to serve, and they get prioritized into the programs because we want to get them through their programs because they're relatively low-risk offenders. So we need to get them into their programs as soon as we can. But we have big program needs. And so what that results in is about 2/3 of the offenders who hit their minimum haven't completed their programming because we have waiting lists. Okay, so that's another piece of the puzzle, because when the parole board comes to parole somebody, one of the things they want to look at is make sure that if they have an assessed treatment need, that we've addressed it. So in a lot of cases, and again, 1/3 of the cases, we haven't been able to address that by the time their minimum comes up. Then the next piece in the incarceration is from the time the parole board says you can go, you're paroled, until somebody actually gets out and walks out the door is 100 days. Now, a piece of that 100 days, and let me be very clear, a piece of that 100 days would be before their minimum. The parole board generally sees them 6 weeks before their parole date, so we generally have a green sheet a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks before they're paroled. But that's 100 days that they wait. Sometimes it's to approve a home plan. Sometimes I'm not sure why it is. But see, when you start adding all these little things up, it's tough to explain at a time when we have no money in the state, and at a time when the governor's put in a position where there's a finite amount of dollars and you can't spend on what you want to spend on because you're spending on things you have to spend on. So if we're spending more than we need to and we're not getting the results, then we have to change the system. So early on in 2010, Governor Corbett, or 2011, I'm sorry, Governor Corbett applied for a grant through the feds called Justice Reinvestment. And what the concept of justice reinvestment is that you put a group together, a group of stakeholders in the system, okay? All the different disciplines, law enforcement, district attorneys, victims, local and state corrections, local and state parole, human services, you name it. Put all these groups around the table and bring a group in from the Council of State Governments, and they do an assessment of your system. And it's not you assessing your own system. They do an assessment of your system, so you get the good, the bad, and the ugly, all right? You get a true picture of where your system is. But what they also do, because they've done this in about 14 states, I believe, somewhere between 10 and 14 states, is then they can overlay the experience in other states. So if you have this problem, well, this state was able to do this. So we applied for this in January 2011. It actually started in January 2012. That's the first meeting we had. And how the structure is all the stakeholders I talked about sit around the table and are presented with the data. And then kind of direct where else to look at. And then in between, so those meetings take place, it's about a 2-hour meeting. And there was 3 of them. Then between those meetings, there's focus groups. And the focus groups really provide the real world experience to the data. So there was focus groups of all the different victims groups. There was a focus groups of offenders and their family members. There was focus groups of law enforcement, focus groups of local probation and parole, focus groups of local jails, to really say, okay, this is what the data says. What does that mean to you? And at the end, which was May 24th, I believe, 23rd or 24th, there's policy options that are presented. And on May 23rd, the policy options were presented to the Justice Reinvestment Group. The governor came to the Justice Reinvestment Group, and he said not only does he endorse the policy options, which I'll discuss shortly, but he said, I want the legislature to pass this with the budget. Now, the sum population reduction in these policy options is a population reduction of about 3,500 inmates over the next 5 years. Okay, and again, this is a multidisciplinary group that agreed to these policy options. So these policy options were turned into legislation, given and worked with the House Judiciary Committee, and was passed out of Judiciary Committee last month. And it was added into this bill called Senate Bill 100. And so what does it do? It does a bunch of things. And it starts by, and let me jump back at the concept of justice reinvestment. So justice reinvestment, the reinvestment piece means you look at your criminal justice policies, you tweak or modify or improve your policies to a point where it will drive your population down. As your population goes down, it frees up dollars. You take a portion of those dollars and you reinvest it into the front end of the system. Okay, that's where the reinvestment piece. So the policy options, the initial estimated savings are in the, I think it's 200 million range, somewhere in that ballpark. 86 million of that designated to be reinvested into the front end of the system to achieve these savings. So let's look at what the policy options were. Number one, let's talk about reinvestment. The reinvestment portion is multifold. One, the victims. Victims groups funding has also gone down for victim services after a crime. So there's a piece of the savings that are reinvested into victims groups. There's a piece of savings for local law enforcement grants. The local law enforcement grants gets to the issue we talked about. And it's not grants for more police officers. It's grants for better technology. And it's also grants for better practices. There's things other states have done that have increased law enforcement and decreased crime at the same time. Hotspot policing, which is really basically putting cops where crime occurs. Or predictive policing. And if anybody, Facebookers, right, you open your Facebook page and it recommends friends, right? There's an algorithm behind it that does all this stuff and recommends friends. Well, that technology is being used in law enforcement to kind of recommend where crime's going to happen. So it's bringing this technology to local law enforcement. There's a reinvestment piece into local probation and parole. Right now, given our current system, local probation and parole has a bunch of reports that they have to file with the Board of Probation and Parole, and the reports really don't tell us much, right? It doesn't tell us if they're doing best practices, if they're doing good assessment, if they're doing proper training. So modify those, and also a portion to train parole officers, especially county probation and parole officers, to do a better job of overseeing staff and give them the tool, overseeing offenders and give them the tools to do that. There's a piece of reinvestment that goes to local criminal justice systems. And this piece is to get to the short min issue, right? To people who come here less than a year. And how counties access this is if you send the Department of Corrections less people this year than you sent last year, we'll pay you for that, all right? Now, why does that make sense? It makes sense because if someone has 4 months to go in a county, when they hit their minimum, they get out, right? So they'll really serve 4 months instead of serving 4 months plus 200 days plus 100 days, all right? So that 4 months quickly turns into a year. And the nice part about this is it doesn't designate what programs the county needs to do to reduce it. That's a local decision by the counties. And also the counties don't have to participate, although we assume most will. So that's a reinvestment piece. The legislation that went in does a couple things. Number one, it eliminates technical parole violators coming back to the Pennsyvlania Department of Corrections. This is a big shift in the force. Historically, we get about 3,000 to 4,000 people who come back to the Department of Corrections for a technical parole violation. No new charge, just a technical parole violation. Those people serve on average 9 months. But if you take out the people who go to these technical parole violation centers in the community, it actually is 13 months for the ones who come to us that they serve. Now, the research on technical parole violations says that there's really no difference as far as recidivism rates for 6 months versus 9 months versus 13 months. So the technical parole violation piece says the vast majority of technical parole violators cannot come back to a state prison. The vast majority of technical parole violators will be put in a community corrections center. All right, some in secure community corrections, some in traditional community corrections. There are some exceptions. If the violation was of a sexual nature, of a violent nature, involved a weapon, or there's a specific threat to public safety, then they can come back to the Department of Corrections. But even for those who come back to the Department of Corrections, 6 months is the most time they can serve there. It's a hard cap at 6 months for somebody who comes back, and it doesn't require another hearing. Now, the hearings are a key piece, and that's something I really haven't touched on. Every month, there's 2,400 inmates who are eligible to have a hearing in front of the parole board. Of those 2,400, the parole board currently only has capacity to see 1,800. So there's 600 inmates each month who are eligible for a hearing and don't get it. All right? At a 60% parole rate, that is in theory about 360 inmates who would be released if we had the capacity to do that. So by pulling parole violators out of the need for hearing, it should increase the capacity. And specifically, the board is being tasked with increasing their capacity to do hearings by 20%, which should increase our releases significantly and also continue to drive the population down. Now, one of the things, as we're talking about population down, there's a couple things you haven't heard me say. You haven't heard me say we're changing mandatory sentencing. That's not part of this package. You haven't heard me say we're lowering the bar on what the criteria is for somebody to get out. We're not changing that. We're just making the system work better. Then there's a group of offenders, the lowest level offenders in our system, misdemeanor 3s and ungraded misdemeanors, who will be precluded from being sentenced to the Department of Corrections. So if you have a retail theft, that's a misdemeanor 3, and you have 5 of them now, and the sentence for each of those 5 is 30 days to 6 months. Our law says you have to aggregate the 6 months, so you have to add the 6 months together, right? And your maximum part of your sentence dictates whether you come to us. So you could literally come to us serving 15 days to 2 years, and you come to the Department of Correction. That won't be the case, assuming this passes. Misdemeanor 3s and ungraded misdemeanors won't be able to come to us. So again, that package together really looks at a lot of the things we talked about. We talked about short mins, and we're incentivizing counties not to send them to us. And oh, by the way, the department is also creating 3 short min facilities specifically designated for everybody who's a short min offender. We talked about the waiting lists and how these short mins add waiting lists to other people by taking short mins and only putting them in 3 facilities. All those 3 facilities are going to do is focus on programming short mins, and the parole board is going to align their resources so they can not only get programming but get their hearings in a timely manner, but we'll also take them out from cluttering the other facilities. So the short min is a big improvement to the system. Now, there's some other interesting facts that we're not really addressing right now. Number one, 55% increase in max outs. 55% increase in the percentage of offenders who max out as opposed to get out under some supervision. Obviously, a big portion of that is sex offenders. And that's not good public policy. To have that many people max out is not good public policy. That is not being addressed with this package that's going through now, but it has to be. And we're working, we just brought a new reentry director on, and one of his big tasks is really looking at that back end and why people are maxing out. We know housing is a huge, huge issue, and appropriate housing and what appropriate home plans are. But it's something that we have to address because, again, having more offenders max out, especially offenders who we deem violent or dangerous offenders, is not good public policy for individuals to be maxing out and have no supervision. That's not being addressed in this package, but it's being addressed in kind of the next phase of the system improvements. So I ran my mouth for a long time. I'd love to, I got a little bit of time left, and I'd love to answer any questions you may have in case I didn't hit anything you're interested in.
We have around 7 minutes or so, because we have to also, in my haste to introduce you, we have an award we have to give this evening from our organization. So around 7 minutes for questions, and then we'll...
Okay, just give me the hook when you're ready.
No problem.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you explain the position for the individuals on pre-release on the Justice for Justice?
Yes, thank you, I skipped that.
Release?
Yep. Pre-release, what pre-release is now is an individual can be released up to a year before their minimum. That piece is being eliminated. So pre-release will no longer go to the community corrections system. What we will do to replace that is, and let me tell you why that doesn't make sense. What the research says is that low-risk offenders do not do well in high-intensity environments. They don't do well with a lot of programming and don't do well with a lot of structure. As a matter of fact, it makes them more likely to commit another crime. Our pre-release system, we do a good job of screening. So basically, everybody who gets out on pre-release is a low-risk offender. But we put them in an intensive program. So the sum of that is our community corrections system, a third of the people who go to the community corrections system fail out of it before they even get out. So that's not effective or efficient. So we're limiting pre-release. We'll replace that with transition units at every prison. And what our goal is with that is instead of doing putting someone pre-release their last 9 months to a year, we're going to focus on getting them to the closest facility to their home. I put an asterisk on that because Philadelphia skews everything, and we're not going to be able to put all the Philadelphia inmates at Graterford and Chester. That's all we'd have there. But we'll get them close to their home and really have them there so they're not getting moved before their parole hearings, and also so we can really start re-engaging those community supports. Because the other piece that I didn't talk about, and then I'll go back to questions, is the legislation includes our ability and actually encourages us to really do a better job with re-entry and engaging community groups, and especially the faith community. Yeah, I think we've come up short on that. We do very good. We have a very good volunteer program. We have a lot of people come in and volunteer at our prisons, but then we tell them they can't follow the individual when they get to the community, which is kind of inconsistent with what we're trying to do with reentry. So that's a policy we're going to be changing. We're really trying to focus on doing a better job of that transition. We talked about a facility being designed in the Philadelphia area at Graterford. At that facility, we're putting a female housing unit, specifically because a third of our female offenders come from the Philadelphia area, and the closest prison is above Williamsport. And what we're working at with that unit in particular is we're trying to partner with the Philadelphia faith community, and we actually have some faith communities who've committed to do this. We're trying to get every female who gets out of there a sponsor from whatever their faith community is. So we really need to do a better job of engaging the faith community, not just in the prisons, but in community corrections and making that transition. Yes, sir.
I don't want to get off base here, but I came tonight just to discuss, see if I hear anything about the lifer inmate situation. I have a brother serving a life sentence down in Dallas, in Missouri. And in my hand I have here, like, the consolidated statutes. I brought it with me. Describes first and second degree murder and life without parole. First and second degree murder in Pennsylvania is life without parole.
Yep.
And wouldn't you agree that the lifer inmate becomes the most expensive inmate in the long term? I mean, due to their care. I mean, my brother is a diabetic, and he's having a tough time. And how can I say? I'm sure the cost is a lot, okay, to we the taxpayer. What is the future? Is there any discussion going on right now as far as the lifer?
There's not at this point.
Not at this point. The most expensive inmates out of all are at this point.
Yeah, but I don't know that they'd be the most expensive. I don't know that I 100% agree with that.
Well, when we're talking about, like,
I mean, if you talk about if they're going to serve X amount of years and those kinds of things.
Well, this life without parole is they're going to be dying inmates.
Mm-hmm.
There's no rehabilitation.
Right, but when you took staffing costs, our capital case are the most expensive.
Well, Laurel Highlands, I know, and I don't want to take too much of your time. Laurel Highlands, I know, is the nursing home is it
Yes.
basically a nursing home?
Yep.
Okay, well, I guess at the end, just to close this, we'll say, I haven't read any legislation that is addressing the long-term inmates.
And there's not at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yes, sir, Beck.
I have a question about rising healthcare costs and the impact on your system with the inmates. Some of the delays you're talking about must impact that significantly.
You know, actually, last year we passed what's called Act 22, which said that inmates who get sent out get charged Medicare or Medicaid rates. So it actually saved us a bunch of money. So our healthcare costs are less than they were last year. And we also just rebid the contract. The new contract came in at a couple $1 million savings.
But does it work?
Does what work?
The healthcare plans for the prisoners, does it work? Does it give them better healthcare?
Yeah, I think we have a pretty good level of health care. And I say that because when you look at the nature of lawsuits we get, and when you compare the nature of lawsuits we get to others, our medical lawsuits are much, much lower than most places, and it's not even our top three of things. So I think we have a very good level of care. And actually, we do a pretty good job with HIV transition to the community, plugging them in. Hepatitis C, we're actually switching to the new protocol. So yeah, I think we do have a good level of health care. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm from California, and we're starting a hospice program in the county jail. That's how bad it's getting here. But I wanted to ask you about one of these trends that I've been reading about is this criminogenic thinking. They're kind of labeling them, saying, you know, you've got to address things that seem to be things of poverty rather than some kind of labeling that they're way different than anybody else. And so how do you guys address that?
Well, criminogenic thinking, I think there's a couple concepts that got mixed in there. Criminogenic thinking is thinking that results in someone committing crime. And how we address that specifically is through cognitive behavioral therapy. Research says that if criminals have thinking errors, and if you address those thinking errors, they'll be less likely to commit a new crime. So criminogenic thinking is part of our assessment process to identify what the criminogenic risks are, what the risks that are related to future likelihood of crime, and then we have programming to address those.
So your low-risk offenders, they have to go through that too, or is that?
They get assessed. Currently, we overprogram, but part of this is that we're going to be reducing the amount of offenders, because as I said earlier, putting low-risk offenders in high-intensity programs increases their likelihood of future criminality. Yes, ma'am.
I guess, why only Philadelphia for the women's? It should be all of the state.
Well, we already have one in the west, and we already have one in the central.
Yeah,
so we don't have
yeah.
any female.
Also, policy and criminal justice issues. I'm seeing, the eventual internship opportunities. I'm seeing it's in Philadelphia. I'm like, wow, I'm taking it right from here, and they have everything else up here.
Yes, sir.
I ask this as a Canadian who's a visitor. With all that you said, have you figured out how your administration wants to respond to crime?
Yeah, I mean, we have a vision, but vision without action is just a dream, you know? So I think we have a good start. I think we've started working towards that. But yeah, we need to stop sending people to us because we're mad at them. Send people who need to come to the Department of Corrections after we assess them based on their risk. We need to program the people who need to get programmed. People don't need to get programmed. Let's just get them out of our system as fast as we can and back to the community. And then do a better job of that community transition at the end. Yes, sir.
You talked about having people come out a little better, or at least know worse when they went in. A lot of that involves humane treatment. And what is DOC doing to have the people treated more humanely? Obviously, they are lawbreakers, or presumably so. But prisons so often send people out with more hate in them than when they arrive.
Yeah, training and supervision and a good grievance system and a good investigatory arm of it is really the kind of what the system needs to have to ensure that. Now, I'd like to say that that stuff never happens, but I'd be lying. It does happen. And we have great staff, but I'm a firm believer that if there's 10 people in the room, one of them's going to be a jerk. So we got 16,000 employees, so you do the math, all right? But having good oversight, except this room. I'm the only jerk in this room. But so I mean, we've redone a lot of our internal checks and balances. We've relaunched a 1-800 number. We now have a website where a family member can anonymously report that. We now have an anonymous number for staff to call, and we're restructuring our entire internal investigations. I think I'm getting the hook now.
Sorry, I'd like to be one of those 10 people. And one last question, please.
Yes, Secretary, we really appreciate you taking the time to come here. However, next time you come, or you go on your speaking, you should have a member of the parole board. Now, you mentioned, you said before you were appointed secretary, you were on a committee, and has there been any changes of any members on the parole board? Because the parole board has the system jammed up big time. That's your problem.
There's been major, well, I mean, we could probably argue about some of that stuff, but yes, there's a new board chair, there's 2 new members, and there's a bunch of seats coming up, and you know, parole has moved forward. This is a partnership. You know, under the corporate administration, this is a partnership, and the parole board is moving forward as we are.
Last question. You said you have 55% of the inmates that are maxing out.
No, that's not what I said. I said there's been a 55% increase in the amount of inmates who are maxing out. Not 55% of the inmates maxing out.
Now, a lot of these inmates that max out, that when they go for a parole hearing, they say, I'm not taking responsibility for my crime. And they get a hit, or they max out. And I think if they, in my opinion, if the inmate has a good behavior record, and it comes up on this minimum, and he's doing a 5 to 10 or 10 to 20, he should be allowed, and you should look into that, because when they max out, like you said, they don't have no supervision. That is real bad. Yeah,
and you know what, maxing out is real bad, but also if an individual doesn't address any of the root causes of the crime, we're not doing them a service by letting them out either. No. But again, I certainly appreciate everybody's time and attention.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And again, as I mentioned before, in my haste to introduce the secretary, I forgot to introduce Mr. Charles Sullivan of CURE, who's going to present an award on behalf of the Convocation.
Well, the recipient of the award said to make it short, so I will make it short. Let me just say, though, my wife Pauline and I are the co-directors of CURE. Of all things, we started in Texas 40 years ago. And over the years, I've heard a lot of directors speak. I think that was the most informative presentation I've ever heard. I think that excellent, just excellent. When I was asked by John Vokla, my dear friend, who is the reason why we're here, who has over the years made this happen throughout the country, to give the person who is our recipient this year the Mike McGuff Award, I went back on the website of the Convocation and looked at Mike McGuff, and I found it very similar that the person that we're going to honor today with the award, Angus Love, is very similar. Let me give you a little background of Father McGuff and then how he was and has very similar characteristics that Angus Love has. In July 1985, Father J. Michael McGuff died of leukemia. Mike was a priest in Detroit and volunteered time visiting prisoners and working tirelessly with hundreds of indigent defenders. Mike was, and this is where I feel Angus is very much, very similar. Mike was a trusted and wise advisor, a calming voice through many storms. About 6 weeks ago, we came to Philadelphia to have a coalition of organizations, and certainly Angus was this calming voice through many storms. And even getting to the meeting and bringing everybody together was quite a challenge. There was a simplicity and directness about Mike, and certainly Angus has, that cuts through the confusion and tension like a razor. Mike was an adventurer and had quite a sense of humor. So Angus, I think if you want to maybe come up here, because you're going to ask you to say a few words. Let me say, too, what we have, and this is the 31st Convocation. So these are all the people that have been placed on the two plaques, and Angus will have his name for 2012 placed on him, and will also be on the website. Yeah, okay. So in describing Father McGuff, who this award is named after, and very similar, unassuming service, in compassion, with a pervasive dedication to the human dignity of the incarcerated. And let me just add something that I'd like to very briefly read a poem that a friend of ours was asked in the visiting room many years ago why she got into this work. So she went back and wrote this poem. And I think it applies not only to Angus, but to many, many people that are here, like the director, our guest. To choose this kind of work takes courage, she said, offering me a compliment on my willingness to tread in the soft quicksand of politics. My eyes widened in surprise. I never thought of it as choice, but merely a necessary risk, because I saw people drowning, slipping quickly beneath the dark liquid surface. I never thought of it as courage. Who would turn their back and walk away? So Angus.